Living ideas. This is the series called the Deep Conversations, where we look at something that we've been spending a lot of time on, and we ask ourselves, what are we learning from this? So today's topic is Carl Jung. We've done more than 30 meetups here on Zoom on Carl Jung. In addition to that, we've done a number over the last 5 years, we've done a number of meetups on Carl Jung in our in-person meetup in New York. And it's a perennial topic that we keep coming back to. The format for Friday is very different from other days. It's the deep conversation format, where everybody gets to talk about what they got from that particular topic. So today's question is, what have you learned from Carl Jung? And I want you to take your time to explicate what you've learned. And we're going to go back and forth. So it'll be a conversation between me and the person who's speaking. My job is to try to understand what the person is saying. These are deep topics. So I'm going to try to understand, put it in my own words. What I'm doing is that I'm essentially, person who's talking is drawing the picture. I'm drawing a frame around it. I'm maybe putting some captions around it, maybe connecting it to other pictures that are there, bringing pictures from other places and putting it right next to it. That's all I'm doing. And the purpose of that, firstly, is for me to understand what is being said, and then make it more accessible to other people. And we will develop a common, I'm also keeping track of all the common points that are being said by everybody. And then we will have a discussion on those common points. So that's the format. So I invite people who are familiar with Carl Jung, who have read, even though they have, not spent years and years, or if they have spent years to years, go ahead and type an exclamation mark to share what you've learned. And then we can go ahead and have a nice chat about that, and we will go to the next person. So we're going to start with Devesh. Devesh, what have you learned from Carl Jung?
Thanks, Shrikant. I think it's a question, in my case, my particular journey with Carl Jung is a big case of what I'm unlearning with Carl Jung. Because I come laden with million concepts, beliefs, opinions, and I must admit, my particular upbringing in what we call I don't know if anybody's familiar with India, you are, but a Gujarati, Indian, Jain business family. We come with laden concepts, beliefs, everything under the sun.
I just want to give a little bit of perspective. So in a Jain Gujarati business family means you learn to count before you learn to speak, before you say words. You sit on the, you sit in your shop along with your dad on his lap when you are 1.5. That's how you start life, and that's the context in which you grow up. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. So I think one of the first things you learn is what is an interest rate, Daddy?
Yes.
But what I'm trying to say is, back to in the Jungian context, the context was what makes your worth. And the worth, whether subconsciously, now that in itself is Jung coming in, subconsciously, without knowing it consciously, your worth is rationality, logic, and how much you add to the coffers, right? Now here comes somebody like me, almost driven to despair, with a million things repressed because of the requirements of conformity within such families, within such values, and you abrogate your own integrity because you don't know what integrity is. You're still living in the conscious space of what you want to be looked upon with approval. So I shoved down into what we might call part of the shadow, which is Jung again. What does Divyesh like? So let's say my innate calling was like you in many ways, philosophy, narratives, psychology, humanistic psychology like Jung and Adler and Fromm and million beautiful things. Let's call them poetry of the soul. However, what good is that when you are calculating exchange rates and hedge and interest rates and forecasts and all that? I did live that life for 26 years. So my experience was all that. So Jung, if I knew there was something wise in this man, but I knew it only intellectually, and that's good enough. It's a mustard seed intro into Jung. But more and more I enter Jung through Jungian analysts like James Hollis and Michael Mead and Marie-Louise von Franz and all the various sources, because I could not understand Jung by himself. But one thing I did gather immediately was there is a transcendent self. Then there are complexes which hijack your rationality on a regular basis without you even knowing you're being hijacked by that. There is the shadow, which is ultimately for wholeness, integration, self-actualization purposes. And Jung uses the word individuation, ongoing process. Then there is the ego king, which needs to be seen for what it is, not dismantled. I mean, ego is ego, but it's a container for consciousness. And there comes one of Jung's pithy, wise statements: is if the darkness comes in the light, in the consciousness, then it's not dark anymore and it will not run you. So I'll shut up, I guess, but I could go on, but I'll just shut up. The thing which hits me is through Jung, there is an avenue, at least through awareness, that we are on an ongoing peeling of the onion to ourselves in a manner which is whole, integrated, and can lead to flourishing. And it doesn't ask for discounting your bad parts, bad in inverted commas. It asks for integration, wholeness, and you can contain and not be run by all these things, like in my case, shoving down what my innate capabilities, and also all the dark things, which I will partake of through the collective unconscious human. And the archetypes are good guides in their symbols to what is at play. Yeah, so I could go on, but I hope that was a simple enough.
All right, Divesh, it was spectacular. I think this is a great start to this conversation, and I don't know where to begin. I really like what you said. I really liked how you started. It's more about unlearning rather than learning, and that's very deep. That's very deep. I think most of us don't realize that it's really about unlearning because we carry so much with us. The second part that you talked about is the extent to which what you grow up with occupies your consciousness as well as a lot of your unconscious. And all of that is something that you got from others. And that is not necessarily who you are. Who you are is much larger than that. And in order to go back to your calling, to your authentic self, it's a big journey. And one of the critical parts of that is to recover the shadow, recover the things that you're pushed down because of the moral evaluations of people around you. And also the interesting, the quote that you had about the conscious and unconscious, that it's by bringing the shadow, the dark, into light, you become whole. It is not really a conflict. Once it's all about integration. It's about going back to the self. So just brilliant. Thank you very much. And what we will do is that I'm keeping track of all the themes that are coming up as well. And we will have an opportunity once everybody has had a chance to talk about what they have learned or unlearned from Carl Jung. We will go ahead and have a discussion on all the points that come up. Folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to share or raise your hand in Zoom. Next up is Joe.
So, I mean, I'm really new to Jung still, and I'm just learning, but some of the concepts were absolutely profound, and most of them have already been covered. The idea of a conscious realm, and that being our ego, and the unconscious, with and our personal unconscious, and then our collective unconscious, and then how that actually factors into the way society actually helps form our very being, and then our personal experiences. I've really kind of you see a lot of overlap with Jordan Peterson as well in their work.
Jordan Peterson is a big student of Carl Jung. So all his core ideas, like for example, Maps of Meaning, which is his magnum opus, is really based on Jung. It is taking Jung's ideas. I have to say that, and I don't think either Jung or Jordan Peterson would disagree with this. Carl Jung is far deeper thinker.
Yeah.
And Jordan Peterson is far more effective communicator of the ideas.
Absolutely.
And so he's also a very good organizer of those ideas. So in Maps of Meaning or through his work, he actually shows you what the consequence of the ideas are. What do they look like? So he's very good at dramatizing it. So absolutely, Jordan Peterson is very much in the Jungian tradition. Please go on.
Yeah, and the individuation process as a whole, in order to essentially have this healthy, functioning personality, I find it to be a very important thing to understand, because and the concept that really hit me was the idea of wholeness. So how do you integrate your shadow into your collective, into your conscious realm?
Joe, if you don't mind, I'm going to keep on talking with you.
No, please do, because I'm very,
because of, for example, individuation, you hit upon it. That's really the core idea of Carl Jung. But it's a very unusual idea of individuation. It is all about saying that become who you are. It is not about going somewhere else, but that the self, you are already there. You are kind of separated from the self because of what you focus on consciously, because what values you hold, you're kind of denying parts of yourself. So individuation is all about accepting all of yourself, becoming conscious of what is unconscious, and that's how you grow. So it is not like you become somebody else, but you become yourself. Please go on.
Beautifully put. I mean, that's wonderfully put. And the idea of archetypes, and the reason why that was really important for me, I mean, it's important in understanding dreams, and I get that dreams are a very important part of dream analysis. Is a big part of Jung's work. But the idea of just understanding archetypes, and I was able to relate that to stories and Joseph Campbell, and you can kind of see where these common themes are across all cultures. So it kind of really helps me in seeing seeing some of what makes us human, essentially. Things like the hero's journey, or things like and then you can kind of see where societies and how they unfold, and the why they unfold the way they do, and what are the different cultural values. But there are some unique things that unite kind of all cultures, and archetypes do that. It also dream work. I think it's a really good, really important.
May I say something about archetypes?
Please do, go ahead.
See, archetypes is a huge idea in Carl Jung's work, and people like Joseph Campbell have done a fantastic job of elaborating those and demonstrating those across cultures. That's core of Jung's work, but people like Joseph Campbell have taken it further, kind of developed it further. One of the key ideas there is that it is very easy for us to think of various things in terms of personalities. And you can think of personalities fighting against one another or interacting against one another is a very good way of figuring out what is actually going on in your psyche. So it's a very crucial tool for understanding what is going on within you or between people. And archetypes are these patterns, recurring patterns that people have been using across multiple cultures. So it is capturing some different human dynamics in a living form, and they have this entire full almost embodied expression, as opposed to dry ideas. So it's a very powerful way of thinking about psychology. Please.
And one of the, an interesting experiment with George, who attends your meetups, who has a dream analysis meetup. We did a couple of dream analysis meetups, and they analyzed my dreams as well as others. And it's amazing the information that you can extract from your dreams and what it allows you to understand about yourself. It's absolutely incredible. So when you're able to use Carl Jung's tools in a practical way, I've actually witnessed how incredibly and powerful that can be. So that to me has been probably one of the most interesting experiments that I've gone into, because I've gone through in just other meetups. There are some other things that I wanted to talk about, but I'll have to think about them for a minute, please.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks, Joe. Anybody else wants to answer the question, what have you learned from Carl Jung? Go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. Don't be shy. You will get much more value if you speak. Who would like to go next? Yes, Goran, go ahead. You can raise your hand in Zoom with the thing. I don't always see everybody. And you are on mute right now. So can you unmute yourself?
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
What I like most about Jung is his shadow concept, and the quote, "I would rather be whole than good."
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole different idea of self-discovery, where we are not trying to polish our surface and hide our inner darkness, but embrace it and incorporate it and integrate it into the wholeness of personality. So that's the part that's most appealing to me. And another quote I like a whole lot that have been my food for thought for a long time was, let me try to remember, one does not get enlightened by imagining figures of light. One gets enlightened by making unconscious conscious. And then years later, I found the following sentence after that: the latter, being uncomfortable, is not popular.
Yes, so let's talk about both of these. I mean, my favorite quote, I think that's not from Jung, but he uses it a lot. In the filth, it will be found. So you kind of have to go through the darkness in order to move forward. Because what happens is that, so why, let me ask you as a question, why do you find shadow to be so powerful, the idea of shadow to be so powerful?
Well, like yin and yang, we have lighter side and a darker side. Now, if I suppress half of myself, or at least half of myself, I have less self to live with, less, energy, less motivation. On the other hand, I have to use a bunch of energy to keep it repressed, So I spend all of my life trying to run away from whatever I think is not acceptable about myself. And that's not a good way to live.
Wonderfully put. Another way of, I think about it is, it's actually very simple. It's saying, respect what is. respect who you are, respect what reality is. What happens is that for most people, the should trumps the is. So you're saying, oh, it should be like this. So you refuse to actually look at what is and then actively suppress. It's not as if reality doesn't go away. Just like a table doesn't go away if you, and you will stub on it if you don't, watch where you're going. Similarly, parts of you don't go away if you say that, no, that should not be, but it is. So, and the point you're making is that people spend this enormous amount of energy suppressing and kind of evading, repressing, and pushing it down. And his whole point is make unconscious conscious as a way of becoming the self. I find his concept of self to be very uplifting. I mean, it's a very exalted view of what a human being is. And once you grasp that, it seems such a waste to try to protect yourself from the whole of what you are, because you want to adhere to certain concepts of what you are that you've learned from others, mostly that it is because of that. So, and it is tremendously liberating. Do you see, so the question is, why do people do that?
Very simple. People are biologically very interested in avoiding pain and seeking comfort. But avoiding pain is the strongest motivation of a human being, I believe, because that's pain generally means some kind of injury or death. So avoiding psychological pain is a motivation. And if something doesn't see something about myself that doesn't fit my image of myself, my ego image of myself, creates intense discomfort and fear, and
absolutely
avoid it at any cost.
Excellent point. I also think of it in terms of comfort, because comfort kind of, sometimes there's not even pain, it's just comfort of saying, because all of this kind of seeing reality, especially when it conflicts with your preconceptions or your desires, requires effort. It requires effort to confront it, to resolve contradictions, to face the pain, to go through kind of failures, realize your limits. And all of that is painful, uncomfortable. And you need the courage to go through that. So wonderfully put. Thank you. Thank you, Goran. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, and there's also this added process of society that, it's the persona that you have to overcome in this process as well. So it's not only the individual going through this very painful process, as you had mentioned, and courage and understanding your limits and understanding, yourself, and it's also, what is the society going to judge me on based on these things? I have to act differently. I have to study differently. I have to do things differently in order to be successful. That's a very, as soon as you're different, it becomes a little bit more challenging. And this is where we put on the persona, and we try to say that, that we're fitting in, but when we're really not. So there's an added layer, and Jung has really uncovered that. And that's an important part of finding out who we are in the individuation process as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Jeff. Jeff, you've been attending our Jungian meetups for some time, both in person and online. What have you learned?
So, Shrikant, one of the aspects of Jung's thinking is the collective unconscious, which is fascinating to me, as well as, if I understand correctly, its association or relationship with finding or discovering or making meaning. And I think I don't understand it very well. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about it.
That's a very good question. That's a concept I don't really understand. I think of it in terms of other concepts. So, so I'm happy if anybody else wants to kind of talk about, yes, Divesh, how would you, if you wanted to explain the concept of collective unconscious, how would you?
I can have a go. I'm not sure whether it will be clarifying. The collective unconscious is the layers. You got various layers till you hit the primordial human, according to Jung. So you've got your persona, the image you give to the world. Then you've got the ego, which is a vessel for consciousness. Ego is not a bad thing, except it has a tendency to overinflate its own needs because of its nature. So it's not a bad thing. It's just its nature is to overinflate, protect, and all that. And Joe already talked about bringing the unconscious to let the shadow unfold into the consciousness. And there are many means to do that, like conversations like this or therapy. And then it stops running you anymore because it's in the light rather than dark, unbidden, you can't see it. And it's running 90% of your show, whether you like it or not. And then, so if you've got, this shadow will reside. The word for shadow generally Jung refers to is in the collective unconscious. We have got our personal unconscious bit, which throws out complexes, which are like mother complex or father complex. There are various different complexes which take over, which hijack. Now, if you follow that process down, you're entering into the world of collective unconscious, which itself can go right down to the primordial. So in my case, Divya Shah, blah, blah, blah. There's a consciousness, which my complexes and everything. Then I come, as I mentioned earlier, I come from a Gujarati Indian Jain family. You will have the unconscious of that element of collectiveness, the family. Then the organism or the community of Indians in Africa and England and Australia. Then you move into India itself. I'm just giving my example. Then you move into the nature. I'm just making it very trivial in a way. So India itself, partaking of all the collective unconscious of that culture, the Hindu background of ours and all that. Then into bigger, and till you start hitting the ones with mythology, have a good way, whether they're Greek or the Bhagavad-Gita or anything, or the Hanuman tales, India or Nataraja Shiva, they all start playing a part as archetypes, which are coming from the collective unconscious. And that is where George Lucas and Joseph Campbell and everybody come with the hero. The collective unconscious is the seat of things like the hero, the trickster, all these archetypes which play havoc with your life. Or if they co-opt into wholeness, that individuation, then these ones have a way of making your life flourish at the same time. That's why we talk about integrating them rather than discarding them. Discarding them, ignoring the collective unconscious in a way, has got will sabotage you sideways. A lot of these complexes.
Divesh, let me go back and forth. I will try to summarize it in my own words.
Yes,
I think of it, I always think of these things in my own words. So these are kind of very, from what I'm hearing you say, these are kind of deep patterns which are there in the society. So these are, at first level, and you put it very beautifully. there are patterns in your family. Then there are patterns in your community, the local community. There are the kind of like the Gujarati family, the Gujarati culture. Then there are patterns in India. And then there are patterns which are there across. And these are deep human patterns. Classic examples would be patterns like motherhood, like mother-child relationship or father-son relationship. Trickster is kind of one of the hero is one of the relationships. And what that is that it's a pattern of being that is held by many people together. So I think of it in terms of, another way of putting it is that the collective unconscious is like summation of all the archetypes. It's all the archetypes put together. I'm putting it I may not be accurate in saying that, but it is basically these subconsciously held patterns, which nevertheless are the driving forces for action amongst people. You can't really understand human action simply in terms of words people are saying, trying to explain it. But this is something that is happening underneath, driving human behavior. Divesh, did I capture what you're saying?
Yeah. And can I add, in integrating these once identified, like they come up to be looked at, the hero, the mother complex, any of these varying conglomeration of patterns which are operating in you, once come into the light to be looked at and they stop running you anymore. I think, Jeff, you mentioned the word meaning. So what happens, I from my experience in the little shadow which has come up to be looked at, I've mentioned elements of it, is you start creating meaning because the integration allows the power of integrated shadow into action. Is you start putting value, worth, and attention on a little bit more right-sized aspects of your life, rather than putting it on an opposite end of some narcissistic trait or something else. You start seeing it contained in a bigger space, such that the meaning gets right-spaced on the right worth and weight on possibly what is good for your own flourishing. And the thing over here I bring in, just to shut up after this, is there's a lovely writer called Andrew Solomon. He went through he's a very...
Let me do one thing. Let me summarize what you said, because you're making a very interesting point. You made it a couple of times. And the point is that it's not about that this is bad and you have to avoid it. In fact, it is all about throwing light on it. And Goran also talked about it, because what happens is that by throwing light on it, it does several things. Firstly, there is an energy that you are using in order to keep it suppressed. You don't need to use that energy anymore. Okay, that frees you up in a very big way. So that's one result. The second is that it was operating underneath, that was driving your emotions directly below the level of consciousness, and that was driving your actions. Now, suddenly when you get aware of it, it rises up and it's seen in relation to other things. You're able to now relate it to other things. And what you're doing there is that you are making a whole. You are actually seeing its function, its proper function, relative to everything else that you have. So what you end up is a larger whole, which is far more consonant with your life, instead of having these forces, blind forces that are driving you, and you trying to ignore them at once, on one hand, and then trying to be railroaded by them on the other hand. Does that capture, Divesh, what you're saying?
Yeah, beautifully and simply put. And as we continue to do this work of peeling of the onion, let's call it that as a metaphor, in the middle of all those so-called wounds, which are all that repressed, all the shadow complexes and all that, as we keep on going, you're coming closer and closer to the transcendent self, the God within, the ultimate infinite source, wisdom. And that is the transcendent source which creates meaning behind the meaning of your life anyway, but with the full understanding that you are linked in consciousness with the collective, with everyone else. The more, simply put, so you're at one with everything, yet you are individuating into your own flourishing in your faculties and capabilities. And that's a blessing by any means. I mean, simple as that.
So Divesh, I'm going to follow up on this point about transcendent in a moment, but please go ahead and complete the story that you are telling, and then we'll transfer it over to Jeff to do a follow-up question or any other comments. So you're telling us something when I interrupted you. You're telling about a story of a person.
Is that me?
Yeah, you were saying something about.
Andrew Solomon. Yes. So Andrew Solomon I think he was a professor in Harvard and Columbia at one point in New York City, and he's written books on depression mostly and everything. He came to Sydney at the Opera House for a talk, and one of the things he said struck me like an arrow in my heart. And thank God it's the heart, because I've always used intellect as a defense mechanism, and it's not working anymore. But what I'm trying to say is, he said meaning making, and because Jeff used the word meaning making in the narrative of triumph, right? It struck me, those words, meaning every ounce of my ups and downs, despairs and highs, lows and everything has brought me to this place with a choice to have meaning making in a narrative of triumph. And this involves, in what it struck me was, the shadow plays a paramount part going through the darkness. I'm not a keen fan of suffering or pain or anything, nobody is. But some of these things, we all have a psyche which desires to be whole. And this whole psyche asks for going through the pain. And once we start doing that and this light becomes brighter, what we call the light of Divya possibly shines. Remember, light entails shadow as well. More shadow, more light, more shadow. So there's always an uncovering, discovering, and process, and you are becoming a bigger space with more shadow, but you've got now more capacity. So, and that is wisdom in the making for you and for everyone, because you're linked consciously, collectively with everyone.
Wonderful. I'm going to hand it to Jeff for continuation, but I just wanted to let everybody know that Divya means bright, and Ish is God. So it's the bright God. Okay. So so he has a big name to live up to.
No chance.
Next up is Jeff.
So yes, Divesh, thank you for noticing my question there with regard to meaning. And because if I understand correctly, this was really a major point of departure between Freud and Jung, where Freud, if I understand correctly, and really I'm not very knowledgeable about this, but sort of viewed religion as sort of a, almost an illness, sort of a weak, orientation. And Jung thought of some, he might have called it religion, but I had a sense that he really was talking more in terms of what today we call spirituality, that human beings have sort of a natural orientation. In a way, we're almost, meaning-making, and I would say meaning-making designers, that we're constantly looking to find the meaning in things. even if we can only discover them by choosing to believe them because we wish to believe them, sort of the ultimate having faith, it may in no sense be reasonably or logically defensible. But look to the extent to which human beings argue and even fight each other over their conceptions of things that are really just, they've chosen to believe because they've chosen to believe them. And this was one of the questions last night regarding how human beings might be able to come together and find a common orientation that can really serve the creation and maintenance of a society, when human beings seem to adopt religions that then they are inclined to argue rather severely with each other regarding which one is right. So this is a very important, question, and all I was aware of really was that Jung drew some sort of relationship here between the collective unconscious and a spiritual orientation, and I'm just curious about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. So what I would say, I mean, though Jung doesn't directly talk about it, he's not really focused. That's not the core of his work to figure these things out. The implicit answer that he gives, and we don't want to go too far away from core of Jung, the implicit answer that he's giving is actually very deep. He's saying that he studies all religions, all mythologies, and sees a pattern in all of them. And he's saying that that is a human pattern, that is core nature of human beings. On the top of that, each of the individual cultures has their own versions of these patterns. And some of them are unusual on the top of that. So there is a core, and then there are these specific patterns. They share some of these commonalities, but then they break off into separate patterns. Now, if you just hold on to a given pattern and act from that, now his focus is that on individual. So if an individual does that, what he's pointing out is that that individual is missing out on the rest of the self. Okay, and by so doing, he's also missing out on the commonality he holds with all human beings. So at the same time, so the growth into your whole self will also lead to a full appreciation of others, because there is a fundamental commonality amongst human beings. So
Shrikant, I think it's a very, very powerful and important thing that you're saying there, Shrikant. I think that an acknowledgement and then interest in and exploration of the things that we hold in common, not only that are just in common to us, say physically, but in common regarding even our sense of what's important to us, what we want.
The methods are dramatically different. The methods are dramatically different.
Right.
The method that Carl Jung uses is more of developing your own consciousness. And so it's a very, very different thing. So you're coming at it from a political perspective of kind of interaction between people. He comes at it from an individual perspective, which is a dramatic perspective. They will, what I'm saying is that they end up at the same place.
Yeah.
That's what it, Divesh.
Sorry, yeah, it was really lovely to hear that. One thing about you, if I look at where his practical implications, one of the and there are many, but one which stands out for a lot of people in this world is his contribution to the 12-step recovery with Jordan Peterson as Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics, all these others. And what happened was a patient, Roland H., was sent to Carl Jung for treatment for runaway alcoholism, like chronic, a gone case. And Jung tried for 1 year worth of psychoanalysis and this. And ultimately, he wrote to a founder of AA, whose name was Bill, and he said, I can't help this guy. He needs a religious experience. Now, his religious experience, he's referring to William James' kind of religious experience. So Jung was talking about it's a spiritual experience you need, where the primary factor is ego deflation at depth. So the ego had taken over as king, mired in self-centered fear, and now if you do that, then everything in the psyche has permission now to start playing, molding, and forging your individuation. And then you start partaking of the collective unconscious. And you've got a bigger, wiser, wider, fluid world to play with. And play with. And in turn, when that happens, when you take the focus of your holding up that rigid persona or a very restricted consciousness, when you take that away and you start, and the psyche starts becoming whole, you partake of the world in your one of the best words I know is an Indian word from Sanskrit called swadharma, your gift to the world. Your light starts shining. Doesn't stop there. You don't stop it, otherwise you're eager, but more shadow comes up and you keep on growing. That's your life. And one thing beautiful about Jung was his curiosity to enter, whether it's the Vedas of India or whether it's African tribesmen in Kenya. He went and stayed. He went and shamans of New Mexico, and he tried to understand this with action. And so the wisdom behind is, I would consider his wisdom to be almost like a shamanic spiritual kind of thing. But he always had to try to make it into science. But the ultimate base is psycho-spiritual for you.
Wonderful.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Jeff. Folks, if you would like to talk about your takeaways or what have you learned from Carl Jung, you're welcome to type ! I'd like to hear from many more people. I want to pick up on one of the themes, and I can keep talking for a long time on Jung. There is no end to it, but I want to hear other people too. So one point that Divesh brought up is the idea of transcendent being, or the transcendent self. There, I see a lot of commonality between the Indian view of God and of the soul and the world, that view, and Carl Jung's view. When I read the Red Book, when I see the mandalas that he draws, and much of his spiritual approach, I think, in some ways he has brought Indian thinking about the spirit into the psychology, into the Western psychology, Western mind, very effectively. So the Indian view of Brahman, which is everything or God, and Atma, which is your own soul. And the big principle is that Tad Tvam Asi, that you are that. So the equation between your own soul and God and everything, that is what I see Jung pointing to when he talks about his self. Divesh, you're familiar with Indian thought. What do you think?
I would say so, very much so, because Brahman, Atma, they are words, but they point to something which is your soul, part of a bigger soul. And Indian mythology, that's where Jung found so much convergence about about the Atma, the Dharma, the soul, the deeds. And also conversely, remember we are talking about shadow and complexes, where if you take in a very trite example, ultimate shadow being given full reign, dark shadow, think of Himmler or Hitler or somebody who's capable of the most massive of evil. And they were giving the shadow full reign. The dark side had taken over. And I think Jeff mentioned like for humanity and everything. So this can happen in India, one of the greatest examples of Jung in action, I would say, would be the Bhagavad-Gita, when Krishna as Godhead is telling Arjuna, the charioteer warrior king in a way, in his own way, that he has to go and fight the other side. And in the other side, this is something you guys can Google up. It's very, very deep, but the story looks very simple. But what he says is Krishna, Godhead, Arjuna, the despondent one, being said, you have to face those demons within. I'm putting it in an archetypal manner. The demons within reside in you, in your own family, which are the other side, and they contain one of the deadening evil of Duryodhana and all that. So when you look at the mythology of the Mahabharata, Bhagavad-Gita, or even the Ramayana with Sita and Hanuman, all these mythologies are Jung in action because they're talking about heroes, they're talking about mother complexes, they're talking about Hanuman, born of shadow, with Vayu and his Kishkinda, the monkey queen, and Jason and the Argonauts in Greece. And what it does, these are all symbols in a way pointing to you. All these exist within you, and the Indian one of wholeness, of Atma, of Dharma, of Swadharma, of gifts. This what is rasa? Rasa is the elements like grief and all these things which come alive in you. You are asking in this wholeness, individuated life in India and Jung would be an enriching, ennobling, empowered. I'm using this because I've written them down for other things. Enlightened, but not that enlightened sitting in a mountain cave. Enlightened is chop wood and carry water, and chop wood and carry water. Enliven lives. And in all this, you've got virtuosity in action. And that's what the Gita asks for Arjuna. And Ramayana, in the Ramayana, Ram is the, what do you call it? The background of individuation in a way, but the real drama is played out with Hanuman and Sita and Ravana, the demon, and also all the goddesses of India, like Durga, Kali, Lakshmi, Saraswati. Each one is a feminine, divine feminine archetypes within each of us. And Kali's particular job is integration, to bring the darkness up. So yes, so in all that long-winded answer, the only thing I'm saying is Indian wisdom, Indian mythology in India is Jung itself in so many ways.
Wonderful, wonderful. So thank you. Let's see. I want to invite other people to talk about what they got from Jung. Let me see. Does anybody else want to, or you're welcome to ask questions or make short comments. You don't have to make long comments. Just go ahead and type exclamation mark. Joe, go ahead.
So this is just something that I recently read about and observed, and it's going to be completely off base. So I don't, if you want to stop it, go ahead. There was an experiment that there were a group of students at the University of Pennsylvania that they were doing, and they were using athletics teams, and they were seeing how to optimize, basically performance, and they were using archetypes Carl Jung's archetypes to see how the personalities of a team would actually interact with each other and what kind of performance it may improve. And they did find that different combinations of the archetypes actually were able to improve performance. And it's proprietary information now, but it was interesting to see a practical application used in a very small kind of it was only 5 or 6 different archetypes that they used when they were applying it to an athletic team. But it was interesting to see it in action. So I know that's a little bit off base, not a lot to comment on it, but it is an observation that I have had in the past year.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. No, it's very, very useful. And it's useful in multiple ways. So the largest example, the best example I've seen is actually in the most popular video on our YouTube, which is going to be, which is a video, Joe, if you can find it, it's basically Richard Owen talking about John Beebe's 8-function model. So what he has done is that John Beebe, this is the work of John Beebe, as presented by one of his students, Richard Owen, who studied with him. And it's a brilliant presentation. The idea itself is very deep because Jung has so many ideas, but these two ideas, two of his big ideas, these folks have combined. It's the idea of cognitive functions on which MBTI is based, for example. The psychological functions of Carl Jung, I found extremely useful. And I like Carl Jung's approach to the psychological functions much more than the MBTI approach. MBTI approach tends to be far more, what shall I say? It is far more limited. They focus on the limitations, whereas Carl Jung sees all these people as having all these 8 functions. They are some are stronger and some are weaker. And that is due to the way in which you have used them over a past, and you certainly have the capacity of changing somewhat, not infinitely, but somewhat, your ability of using different functions. So it's a combination of the functions with archetypes of how these functions work in conjunction with archetypes, like the hero archetypes, like your primary function is the hero function. Your secondary function, which is your guiding function, is like your father function that is guiding you. Your third function, which you take delight in, is the child function. So you have a certain, and then there is a opposite function to your hero function, which is like the anima function. So it's a very, very beautiful way of thinking about it. And so I invite you to look at that. So now I want to talk about some of the favorite things that I have read of Carl Jung. For me, the most influential ones have been the concept of self and the concept of individuation. So that, self and individuation is one. Second is psychological functions. I found them extremely useful to think about human beings. In terms of a single work, my favorite one is the 7 Sermons to the Dead, which is the only fiction that he has written. It's an artistic work, very short work. And I recommend it very highly because dramatizing what it means to be a human being and what are the issues is a very powerful way. Art is very powerful because it creates an image, it creates a story that brings to life all the interactions that you're trying to talk about explicitly. So it's a very short, powerful work. So I recommend it very highly. Anybody else wants to share anything that they have read by Carl Jung or about Carl Jung that they have found useful? Go ahead and type exclamation mark. Everybody is very quiet today. What's going on? Joe, go ahead.
I was wondering if actually you could maybe expand a little bit on the use of mandalas.
Yeah, I mean, see, the thing is, I'm also a very visual person. I always try to summarize. I draw the diagrams. I'm going to do a quick preview. So this is, we are studying this book called Design Way, and this is my current like summary of it. No, I'm going to talk to you about it, Joe.
Okay.
But I'm going to explain it. But what it is that it's like a mandala. The basic, I'm not going to be able to put it in words well enough. Okay. But what it is that it's a way of visually capturing the whole, characterized by the circle primarily, and then you're breaking it into parts. And it's a very powerful way. It's a way of capturing everything you want to capture. Many times before you can have the full explicated words for it, you are able to draw it. So it kind of starts off like that. So, Jung famously said that he formulated his core theories with the Red Book, and then rest of his life was explicating most, so it points to it's about using the right brain to see patterns, and building from there. So that would be a quick answer. Anybody else has anything that they want to bring up? All right. Go ahead. Joe.
What? Maybe this might be just a question again. What did maybe Carl Jung get wrong?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So I always look at people in a historical context. So what is it that he got? Okay, I think what he got was he figured out so you have to look at a time in order to figure out a place of a person in history, history of thought. Mm-hmm. You have to place him. You have to understand the time before him. He's operating in the West. So in one way, he brought the East to the West. So he brought the Indian thought, for example, some of the Chinese thought, focus on consciousness. Like the West is very much focused on the outside reality, whereas East is focused inward, especially India is focused inward. So he brought the inward focus to the West. He worked on depth psychology. So what he's looking at is he's making us aware of things which are below the level of consciousness that are driving you. So he built up the understanding of that. Those, I would say, if I have to kind of quickly say, okay, what did he do? So he brought the East, he brought, more specifically, I would say India. He brought Indian thought into the psychological literature of the West. And secondly, he developed an appreciation of the unconscious. He also did it in the way where unconscious is, that, he has this really exalted concept of self. So unconscious is not something to be afraid of, not something that is kind of inexplicable, but it is simply that it is not conscious yet. And you have the ability of doing that. So he projects a very high opinion of what human beings can be and ought to be. So that's his strength. What is his weakness? That's a very good question. The thing is that, he focused on what he focused on. So I don't think he worked out fully the kind of the social aspects of that in terms of what is the consequence, how do you apply it? So but that's, I don't think it's fair to call it a weakness. He did not explicate, work on that fully. I think that the people like Julian Jaynes have a far better understanding of the conscious mind than Jung does. So in that sense, I consider it to be a very good pair. Like if you want to understand the unconscious, look at Jung. Don't look at Jaynes. But if you want to understand how the conscious actually functions, what its strengths are, I think Jaynes does a far better job of doing that. So I would say at the kind of conscious and unconscious level, that's how I would divide the strengths and weaknesses. Devesh, what do you think are the strengths and weaknesses of Carl Jung?
Well, Joe asked about the weakness. There was a lot of placing of, not a lot, but quite a few elements on Jung. But you started off saying that, Shrika, he was a product of his time. So we have to take that into full account. So there were cases of, Jung is a misogynist, and Jung is this, and Jung looked down on this other cultures, and he was a product of his time. I would absolve all that just on that basis in his over and above curiosity to go to India and everywhere else and bring it in his very well aware that he was from the West. I mean, he was from Central Europe, Middle Europe. And he was aware of that, and also aware of the Calvinist Swiss background he grew up in, and all the norms which create the restrictive. So he could have acted out or said things based on that, which in all senses, his willingness to be a channel of his wholeness or everyone, to bring out our curiosity about who am I and all that, sort of, in my case, it absolves him. I mean, if I keep on nitpicking on Jung's faults, I think I personally, nobody's nitpicking here. I'm just saying, if I've got a tendency to do with everyone, but I'll miss the whole thing he's talking about, the wholeness. And the other thing, another criticism which was leveled at him.
Don't talk about criticisms that other people mistakenly level. If somebody asks you, what do you think are weaknesses?
I think I answered. I find him one of the wisest sources of psycho-spiritual guide to yourself. Let's put it that way. And I'll take that over a lot of other people, a lot of other psychologists or CBT or other kind of therapies or whatever. One of the things, it does take time. With Jung, it's a continual unfolding and a willingness to stay in that shadow space and all that. It's a time thing, but it reaps richer rewards than over time. Individuation is an ongoing process.
Wonderful, thank you, Devesh. All right, so the next thing I want to look at in Carl Jung is to compare Carl Jung's work with all the meetups that we have been doing. Try to relate it as best as you can. Okay, so one is Jordan Peterson, very clear example. Order and chaos. Okay, so let's look at the concept of order and chaos and concepts of Carl Jung. We've been looking at Tao Te Ching, the concepts of the Tao, the sage, the yin and yang, those concepts as related to Carl Jung. So those are the two things that I can think of. So let us start with Tao Te Ching. The Tao and the sage is what he's talking about. It's very much along the lines of what he's talking about. The yin and the yang is kind of, the unconscious and conscious. Tao is the whole, the self, and sage is your commitment to going on that path. So that entire way of thinking, also notice the thing that distinguishes it. See, what happens is that Western thought tends to operate in contradictions. So this, not that. Whereas this Jungian thought or the Chinese thought, it is in terms of contraries. It's like breathing in and breathing out. That's my favorite example from my friend Yasuhiko. Like breathing in and breathing out are in opposite direction, but both require each other. If when you breathe out, you breathe in. When you breathe in, you breathe out. And both those are natural. And life is like that. So that notion is very much, so I see a lot of parallels between Tao Te Ching and Jung. Joe.
I mean, I see a lot of parallels as well. Primarily that it's the Tao Te Ching refers to nature. How do you live through nature, and how do you live through your personal nature on top of that? So that is a very Eastern concept that Jung actually applied, a lot of psychoanalytic theory to this, and how to, how do we look at our ego? How do we live through nature? How do we actually or become more adaptable and things along those lines? Whereas if you were to compare this to the alternative Western type of methodologies and philosophies, they are very much more in line with the I want to say putting a name to everything as opposed to actually letting something be. That's the best way I can put it at this particular moment in time. I know there's a better way to say it, but that essentially it's to look internal versus external is the most important thing that I see in that Jung, and then to look at the persona on top of that, and to look at our how do we challenge our shadows internally. And you can only do that through your own personal nature. You can't do that from an external source. That would be my assessment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe.
My best
Mike,
shot.
Mike, what do you think? What have you learned from Carl Jung?
He's kind of a hero of mine, as well as as a hero to a number of other people that are on this panel. And Davish made an intro into this area of how he developed his view of life, and there was this guy named Wolfgang Pauli, who is considered one of the major thinkers in the field of quantum mechanics, and a bridge to Einstein and Schrödinger and all of those other people that created the concepts of modern science. Pauli, after a divorce, because I guess Pauli was spending too much time in his research and neglecting his wife, so she took off to discover herself. Pauli descended into deep alcoholism, and through their common university connection, Pauli ended up on Jung's couch, or whatever he used as his analytical psychology thing, and so that gave a concept of what causality and science was all about to both men. And so Jung learned a lot about quantum mechanics and the rational irrationality and acausal events that occur in quantum mechanics, that if you learn enough about it, you find out they may not really be acausal, that they are definitely predictable. It's just that we may not be able to predict them from our limited worldview. Pauly wrote a number of books on psychology and his view of life, and a number of papers on that subject.
What does he have to say? What does Pauly have to say about Carl Jung?
Well, he has a paper on on how consciousness arose. And that paper has turned out to be a basis of a lot of what Conway and Wolfram have done in cellular automata, of how the mind works and how a mechanized mind ought to work.
Did Pauly have anything to say about Carl Jung, or his, what he got from Carl Jung?
There are papers that got published in the Red Book, and in a book that Jung wrote called The Secret of the Golden Flower, which came out of quantum mechanics and specifically mentioned Pauly.
Got it.
And you had that lady who came up with some of Pauly's private letters. I forgot her name.
I forgot. What do you think of Carl Jung? What? I mean, I know you're a fan, but what are the big things you've learned from him?
Well, I learned that. What I learned is that he had a view on rationalizing and normalizing all the religions and the occult and life after death, and how the mind works into a common framework, which I only vaguely understand. I think in terms of psychology, I think he at the end of his life, he probably thought he understood it, but I don't understand how the human mind works or how the machine works. If you look up Conway's Game of Life,
let's not go too far.
It's based on archetypes and how deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning and symbology and all that stuff get put together out of.
Let me ask you one more question.
Okay.
What would you say is, the comment I made about that Julian Jaynes understands consciousness better and Jung understands the unconscious better? Would you agree or disagree?
I don't think there's that big a gulf between conscious and unconscious. And I guess you can put in Gilchrist in that same boat. Now Gilchrist is based on Jung, and also Gilchrist talked about that much of consciousness and unconsciousness, and where all the random thoughts that we get, including the ones I'm throwing at you right now, really come from. And Gilchrist talked about it being hallucinations, and talked about how drugs like the naturally occurring ergot and some of the more modern synthesized drugs create similar hallucinations that
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, one of the things that you brought up is the idea of order and chaos. And in thinking about this, and I have to think about it more, in a way, he gave us a framework to discover what chaos is. And he did that by identifying the shadow. Because if you don't integrate the shadow, then chaos will ensue. So he actually gave us a new way, and I would even say even like a way of actually defining what chaos really is in our own lives that no one else probably up until that point had. And this is the basis for things that all the symbols that Jordan Peterson uses, and how just basically challenging our dragons. There are a tremendous number of concepts facing your dragons and the filth that will be found. All of this is based on the fact that he was able to articulate exactly what our shadow is and the ramifications of not integrating it, and what that means on a personal scale, and what that could actually mean on a societal scale. There was also something else that he talked about.
Can I talk? Can I
Go ahead.
respond to that? Okay. So that's a great point. The interesting thing is that the concept of chaos is much larger. I've always had problem with the word chaos, because really the right word is potential, because it has both the positive potential and the negative potential within it. It's just that it is unknown. It is outside of order. Everything that is outside of order, outside of consciousness, and the entire positive upside also lies there, and all the downside also lies there. So I think potential is a very good way of thinking about it. And the point about chaos, the point about shadow is when you have shadow, when you are using your order in order to push away from your consciousness aspects of the potential, whether positive or negative, that are coming at you. And you're creating this kind of darkness by your pushing it away. The best example, most dramatized example, my favorite example, is the story that Jordan Peterson talks about of the dragon that is
Right.
there, and the dragon that keeps growing as you ignore it, and it keeps
Right.
becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's very much of the shadow. So just wanted to make that kind of distinction between kind of the potential. And what Jung is saying is that the potential that we have is incredible. His idea of self, or the whole, is that potential, of which you're aware of only a small part. And so it is more of a positive thing. But in order to engage that positive thing, you need to have the courage to go through whatever discomfort you have to go through in order to make that, to see it, because you have not seen it before. Thank you, Joe. Please go on.
No, I was just going to say, so that brings a little bit of clarity to me as well, looking at potential. But that potential comes out one way or the other. It doesn't stay dormant, and that's a really important point, because then how that manifests itself in behavior, that could be very destructive, or it can be very liberating. And so that the example that, yes, like I've heard with Jordan Peterson with a dragon in the closet, and then finally the dragon owns the house, or something like that. And essentially that's what it is. But yeah, that's that to me though. But being able to identify the shadow to begin with, I think is a massive contribution to that, to psychology, and to me personally as well, because when you start to really look at yourself and think about yourself in terms of the shadow and the unconscious realm and all the persona and everything, it really does provide you with a way of reevaluating yourself. It may not always be the most clear way of saying it, the way he writes, but it's certainly incredibly powerful. Anyway, that's all I wanted to add.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things, one of the parallels that I see is between strengths and weaknesses. What happens is that you have certain strengths, and by exercising those strengths, you have actually your weaknesses, which are tied at the hip with your strengths. Because you're focused on something, you're not focused on the other thing. And you can see that in the Jungian functions. You can see it in your personality. So I think that's a very good, that's a kind of an alternate way of getting at that point, that if you focus on something, then you're not focusing on something else. So thank you. All right, does anybody else have anything to say? Goran.
Yeah, me. I am not quite familiar because I haven't been attending frequently all these other gentlemen that you mentioned, but I really like the metaphor of a dragon. So the thing is, like, there's this dragon, yeah? So what do people do with the dragon? They try to kill it. Unfortunately, our dragons are not killable. They are not killable. Then they try to lock them up in a dungeon, right? Well, that kind of works for a little while, but it grows stronger and bigger, eventually breaks out and does all kind of havoc. Well, the other way is to love a dragon. Love a dragon. And then it's possible to tame it. And then it's possible to ride it. So riding a dragon is a very powerful concept. Example. So I was talking about this actually in some group, and I was talking about me accepting that I'm a loser. Okay. Maybe not literally, but there is some little kid in me when I was 5, I don't know, that figured out that I'm a loser, right? For whatever reason. And then the whole life tried to prove that I'm not a loser, right? Well, the next time the guy comes and says, Goran, I was thinking about what you said. How about if I just acknowledge and accept that I'm a loser and set myself free? Now think about it. That guy has been spending his entire life trying to prove that he is not a loser. Think Trump, for instance. And then, but it can't prove it because the feeling is still there. The dragon is always there, nipping at his heels, you know. Accepting and being okay with it is a portal to freedom. Now he can do whatever he wants. He doesn't have to get another degree or get another raise, or there's no need for any of that. Now it's free to do whatever you want. A loser can do whatever you want. The guy to try to prove that he is not a loser is always in that prison. So that's an example of riding a dragon of loser into freedom.
Wow. Love it. I think there's several things. I mean, I want to take it along 2 different lines. One is the power of acceptance, because that is very deep. I mean, like, for example, Devesh was talking about 12-step program. Starts with the serenity prayer. Accept the things you cannot change. Like, you can't really do anything without that, because if you don't accept that, actually you're actively pushing back against reality. And it's a losing battle. It's a never ending and always losing battle, because things are what they are. And your starting point is the acceptance. The second thing is about dragons. Okay, so let's be a little bit metaphorical and let's look at the history of dragons throughout cultures. Dragons have very different meanings everywhere. Like in the West, dragon is this dangerous animal. Not so in China. Okay, China doesn't, it has a very different kind of connotation to it. You can look at dragon as, the story that Jordan Peterson talks about is this dragon which keeps growing by when you ignore it. So it is a symbol of unknown in that sense. For Nietzsche, dragon is the dragon of society, of all the cultural values that are limiting you. So there, dragon, the common thing is that it's very large, and it has actually very, very different characteristics, across culture. And each of those characteristics are different. So for example, taming, in case of in the Eastern tradition, I think, which I don't know very well, the Chinese tradition, it's all about accepting the dragon. So this is part of nature. This is just nature. This is nothing to be afraid of. This is just nature. The dragon of Nietzsche is about fighting the dragon. It is the sum total of all of the cultural things that are holding you down. And you have to kind of fight the dragon, and you have to kill a part of the dragon as a lion in order to become a child. So it is like taking, kind of getting rid of the cultural norms that are holding you. Nietzsche, of course, does not understand what Carl Jung does, that dragon, what he despises, is actually something that is needed for you. There is the sum of all social constructs. There is all kinds of bad things in it, but fundamentally there are life-giving things in it which are holding you. So it is a question of separating out what it is, whether it is unknown, known, whether it is positive and negative, and then actually having the courage to accept it and to write it. So it's really, really beautiful metaphor, and would love to explore it further. Jean.
Yeah, I want to share the Chinese understanding of dragon.
Please.
It's not accepting it. In China, the dragon means the emperor. The emperor is the dragon. That's what they symbolize. So it's more like a dominant force, and everybody have to accepting the hierarchy. So dragon presents the highest power. But anyway, I'm not the expert.
So basically it is similar to what Nietzsche is saying. It's like sum total of the most powerful things in society. It's a representation of culture, not nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So they use the nature. They think dragon is kind of the most powerful thing. So then the emperor actually is part of that. So he's not human. He's like the dragon from, the superpower, basically.
Got it. Folks, I stand corrected. Jean knows what he's talking about. I don't. Go ahead, Jean. You had your other stuff.
Yeah. So, Carl Jung, I think it's, I actually think that's the best thing I learned from this group. And I think he's, everything else is like Jordan Peterson. I think Jordan Peterson is kind of like easy version of Carl Jung, because Carl Jung is so deep, so sophisticated. And even the 16 personality also come from Carl Jung. So everything else, I think Carl Jung, he read the right book. In China, we have another novel, famous novel called Right Book. And that book, we have so many interpretations, book writing about that book. So I think Carl Jung have the similar, thing, because he's and I think his best contribution is integrate the Western and Eastern thinking, integrate together. So I think he's, unfortunately, no other people seems to be able to do that, to create a new kind of like philosophy or religion, whatever, to be able to do that. He seems the one who can really can understand both and make it into one. I think that's what really make him so different. That's why there's a huge school about him. The whole psychotherapy is based on his theory. I wish there are more people, there will be at least one person come after him, continue what he's doing, and have more impact in the world. What I learned the best is, one is the 16 personality. It really helped me to understand myself and all the people around me. What I found is interesting, I'm a thinker. I shared before, like I found that some of my friends are feeler, and seems the opposite attract each other. But then recently I have some big fall with a friend, and she's a feeler, and I realized, oh my God, the different thinking sometimes huge clash, because I don't know. So it seems it's maybe at a different time, people need different things. So I have this theory. I said, feeler is the people living the moment. So thinker is living eternal. So feeling change all the time. So the relationship, the friendship with feeler can never last because they're living in the moment. They can be your best, most caring friend when they are around you, but they could totally forget you when they're not around. So they are totally not reliable people. That's my recent discovery. But anyway, so another thing I learned is the order and chaos from Jordan Peterson, and also the shadow. And I also want to share one of the best thing I learned recently, actually email you the link too, is about Dr. Gabor Mate. And I think the guy just mentioned about the story. And we learned that when we were at Landmark too. You know, we all create the story when we were young, and that's dominant our thinking process. And actually and what we try to do at Landmark is try to break that so we can have start from scratch. And this Dr. Gabor Mate, he's talking about exactly, he actually found out they can predict who get cancer based on their personality and view. So our physical well-being is all related to our psychological and mental health. And whatever we experience doesn't determine the external experience doesn't decide our feeling or real experience. That is based on our interpretation. That's all called consciousness, you know, what Carl Jung called. And everything else seems to come together. Everything, it seems that Carl Jung is the link, help me understand everything else around it. So, and I found Dr. Gabor Mate, I strongly recommend. I'm listening to him all the lectures last 2 days. Just amazing. So that's it. Thank you.
How do you spell it? Can you put the name?
Yeah, I will put it in the chat.
Chat?
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Jean. Just great observations. I fully agree. I think I also find the kind of psychological functions very, very useful in trying to understand what is going on, because what it does is that it actually shows you how different people are, you know, and what happens is that it did 2 things for me. So first thing it did was, so firstly I have to tell you, like when I discovered this, I always do meetups. So I started doing meetups in New York in person, and I would get about 80 people to show up, of people who are really interested in Carl Jung's psychological functions, MBTI. They would have all taken tests. They would know their types. And then I would do experiments. I would divide groups in various ways of this type and this type together, and this versus that, all of them, and try to find out what people's experiences were. So I did all of that. It did 2 things for me. One is that you can kind of see where you are, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, because it allows you to, and I strongly believe that it's not just tests. Tests are very, very iffy. You kind of have to look at it, you know, test is just one of the data points. There are these great videos by Michael Pierce that talk about each of the types, which give this rich description of each of the types. So you can see whether they match what you are like or not. And then you actually interact with a lot of people and try to get feedback from that. So you can see the entire richness of variation in people. So that's one part. The second part is that you also learn how you can, you learn a lot about human interaction, because many times I found that, like, I would be at loggerheads with somebody, and then you suddenly realize, oh, they are focusing on the issue like this, I'm focusing on the issue like this. And if I just simply understanding that removes all the kind of anger and disappointment and offense, and you just get down to the business of saying, okay, so how do I communicate with that? Joel, you're familiar with psychological functions. What do you think of psychological functions? What have you learned from psychological functions?
I have actually a direct experience with psychology.
No, Joel Schuster. He's been working on it for about 30 years. Sorry.
I've been working on it more or less for 30 years, but I'm not sure I've learned very much. I find they're an interesting model. They're another way of viewing things, like what you have discovered. It allows you to appreciate perhaps the other perspective that a person is approaching a problem with. But beyond that, they're all interesting exercises. But I have to leave, but I just wanted to thank you for bringing these 7 sermons of the dead to my attention. I had never read them before, and I picked them up off the internet, and now I've got some reading. So thank you, Shrikant.
Yeah, the interesting story of that, there is a gentleman here in New York called George, who's been running meetups on Carl Jung. And I've always wanted to attend his meetups. I wanted to attend his meetups for a long time, except that he had readings for each of his meetups, required readings. And they are usually, the readings were about 300 pages. This was the only meetup where the reading was like 20 pages. So I said, okay, I've been waiting to attend this meetup for past whole year. This one I can do. So that's how it started. And it is a gem. It is a gem. So thank you. Thank you, Joel.
I've been to a couple of Jorge or George's meetings on Jung. They're way over my depth, but I do enjoy listening to him, and he certainly has a passion for it.
Absolutely. Joe, you had a comment. Go ahead.
Just really quickly, it would be, it's worthy to know, and I don't remember a lot about it, but I remember a few videos that I had watched along, and this is like 18 months ago, but essentially how Carl Jung's feeling that the more people that go through the individuation process, the less susceptible they are to a tyrannical government. And that's an interesting that's an interesting way, because I thought of actually even in comparing, because I guess if everybody finds out for themselves who they are, and they're not necessarily identifying with the society as a whole, the external things that are dictating what their actions are, then you're naturally going to be you're going to have less control over individuals who have control over themselves. So that's a very interesting thing. And I guess you could even say the Tao, where you look internally and as opposed to looking externally, there's some relationship there too. But that it does have societal implications in the sense that if you look external for your validation and you live through your personas, then those people are much more susceptible to a demagogue or a totalitarian type personality than people that go through to understand themselves. That's just something that I thought about. Wonderful.
Thank you. All right, folks, this was a great meetup. I really like this format. I think I get to talk to people, and I think it's a good way of kind of seeing where people are coming from and exploring this. It's good to be talking about Carl Jung after a long time. We've been kind of talking about him behind his back when we're doing Jordan Peterson and all kinds of other topics. He keeps showing up everywhere anyway, but it's good to be talking about him directly. So that's great. We have some incredible meetups coming up. So on Monday, we are beginning a series on the design way, which is a very profound idea, which is about combining our various faculties of intuition and reason, of focus on reality and careful analysis of truth, and using that to both project and build an ideal future in design. Well, that's what design is about. So this is based on a book by Harold Nelson called The Design Way. And we have assembled an amazing panel. Joe Charlie has just agreed to join us. So he has very deep, he's very excited about that. Jean has joined us, and I'm really excited about hearing Jean talk about this because, as she was saying, that is her approach to design for a long period of time, though she has not read the book. And it would be really good to have that kind of, an architect's point of view as we go on. So I'm really looking forward to that series. We are starting Monday at 9 p.m., the coming Monday. Yes, Jean. Jean, you were saying something? Oh, Joe, go ahead.
It's funny, and I haven't read much of it, but it said everyone is designing at one time, whether they're conscious of it or not. So, it's whether they're conscious or not, they're the designer in one way, shape, or form. So I guess it goes to the conscious and the unconscious. So.
Jean, what do you like about this book?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I just realized recently, I have a friend, I'm trying to help her to find a new job, whatever. So I just realized my friend is extremely smart, but I realized she doesn't have a plan. Like she was changing to a computer, then back to, she already licensed accountant in China, but she not doing accounting, not even licensed here. She's super smart. I just realized there are a lot of people who are very smart, but somehow they don't have a plan or design of their life. And I realized I'm actually very fortunate because I learned drawing. I always contribute my learning of drawing helped me so much in my life, because when you draw, we learn this pencil rendering. You always look at the big picture first. You do this overall structure, then you add details, then you come back again, look at the big pictures, then you get back to details. You never just get into detail and never come out. So I really think this training helped me so much in my life because I can always keep the big picture all the time. So I think the same as design, because the training in the design, you mentioned why there are so many people are architects. I actually think, French, the best mayor of French actually study planning, and even in Germany too, so I think the people really have the design in mind. The training works in every different field. It's unfortunate we don't learn it. They don't teach it to everybody. And I think we all need to learn, because everything, I even not believe in God, but when I make anything, I think when we create anything, we're like God. Like even when I cook, I said, oh, I feel like God. I design, I create these things. I think it's such a joyful experience to create anything new in the world based on your imagination and your vision and make it happening. That's design. So I think the design is make us like God.
Wonderful, beautifully put, Jean. Beautifully put. So that, folks, that's what we are going to do. We are going to try to show people that this is what it means to be human, to be building things. That's how you build your life. That's how you make whatever it is that you're making. You're taking responsibility for it. You are projecting the highest ideal. You're trying to be as reality oriented as possible. You're trying to think as clearly as possible to make sure that you've taken everything as much into account. You are making sure that it has the emotional impact, the spiritual impact that you want, and you're trying to build all of that in to whatever you're making. And that's what this book is about. It actually approaches it at that level. So please join us. See you soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.